What's up, everybody? I just want to make this short and quick because the rest of the video certainly won't be. I worked on this review for way too long, and I apologize if anyone actually watches through the whole thing, but it's way more in depth than you would really want or expect from a review. So without further ado, here is Resident Evil 4 Remake. If you've played the original Resident Evil 4, you're not going to encounter anything with this remake that's remotely surprising. When it comes to story, the story is almost exactly the same. There are some moments of dialogue and just some overall writing where it's kind of noticeable that they've ignored some of the retcon and stuff that's been jumbled around in the series throughout time, specifically Operation Javier as it relates to Darkside Chronicles, which was retcon to begin with. The rest of the story is pretty straightforward. It's pretty much exactly the same. The only real change they made to the characters that actually matter was Luis. They've clarified some details about him that used to just be speculation. Overall, as far as like actual writing goes, it was a big deal allegedly with certain people before release how they've classed up the game, I guess you could say. There was a lot of like silly double entendres and like sexual references and just dumb stuff that I guess kind of was a result of where Capcom was at that time in 2000 to 2004. I personally don't care. I guess I can understand how people might have found it offensive, but that's really the only reason I think it was changed, was to appeal more to modern audiences. Because you're talking 18 years, like there were kids that weren't even alive when Resident Evil 4 came out playing this game right now. I'm not just talking like kids, I'm talking kids like 18, 19, 20. Yes, it's 2023, but you know what I mean. So the dialogue is a little bit more serious. Some of the more ludicrous stuff, especially like Salazar's voice acting or Sadler's voice acting or just dialogue in general, has been kind of tweaked.
I'm American.
What are you talking about? Did you really think I'd trust an American?
Leon curses a lot in this game. I don't care. I mean, it doesn't mean anything to me, but it's just a funny change. Like everyone in this game curses as much as they can. Really the main changes were to Ashley. Ashley is no longer a useless escort quest. Now, she's still 99% useless, but she's not as bad as she used to be. Because if you've played the original, you know that every time she was even threatened, whether she was actually being attacked or not, she would scream, you know, "Help me, Leon." And that's one of the memes of the original game. It's like everyone just got so tired of that crap. So they've changed that completely to much jubilation for sure. And then she's also a bit more mature and she has more depth to her character this time around. She actually feels like she could be a human being rather than just this two-dimensional damsel in distress.
Leon!
Ashley!
Obviously, one of the chief reasons to remake Resident Evil 4 would be the fact that it's 18 years old. So with RE Engine, they've dramatically improved the graphics. Everything is obviously much higher resolution, higher polygon. The effects look really good, whether it's things like light shafts coming through windows or the particle effects like dust or crap that gets blown everywhere when a grenade or explosive goes off, or like water spraying up into the air when you're in the boating sections, or fire. Fire is kind of a weird one because there are parts of the game where fire looks really good, like it did in Dead Space Remake, and then there are parts of the game where it just kind of looks good, like you would generally expect for most games that have fire. The dynamic lighting is really good. The purple flames that are present in every merchant area add a really cool element to the game as far as horror goes, because you can see off in the distance when you get anywhere near a merchant that the entire area is illuminated by that purple or It's illuminated by that light,
no,
so
that's
you
not
know that
including the
safety
merchant.
is up ahead. I mean, the graphics aren't super impressive all of the time in the game, but they are very good, obviously in comparison to the original, because on GameCube and PS2 you didn't have the capability to have effects like depth of field or motion blur or film grain or dynamic lighting, really. I mean, the original kind of had dynamic lighting, so everything just looks really good. High resolution, just crisp and really cool. The gun models especially look extremely good. If you look at them in model viewer, they look really cool. And that was the case with Resident Evil 2 and 3 Remake as well. I really don't have a lot to say about the graphics other than that it looks gorgeous, which is what I expect from a game in the Resident Evil engine. Or the RE engine, if that's not what it stands for. But it's just, you know, it's like a necessary component of making a game, especially remaking a game, is that it just looks good in 2023. They took the dark, atmospheric, moody appearance of the concept art and a lot of the box art and stuff from the original that was pretty much in people's imaginations, and they've actually applied that to this new game. And you'll notice it looks a lot like Village in some areas. There are parts that literally look like they came directly from Village, only because you can see mountains in the background, and they look similar to how they looked in the latter sections of Village where you could actually see the mountains. But in the Village especially, you can see it's very like gothic Texas Chainsaw horror kind of looking, where everything is just dark and kind of creepy and covered in volumetric fog. It's cool because, as you would expect, each of the three chunks of the game kind of has its own aesthetic. So the Village is more like dark and moody and, again, kind of Village looking like what a lot of people would remember the original RE4 Village looking like, you know, with rose tinted glasses versus what it actually looked like. And that again extends to the castle, which is also kind of the same aesthetic. There's a lot of volumetric fog and dark lighting. Dungeons and everything is just kind of old and decrepit and grimy. And that really, again, the island has the same art style, but it's just slightly different, where it looks a little bit modern. Obviously, you have machinery everywhere, and like how you just disappeared. Rebar and fences and electronic doors and computer systems and stuff. Probably the most significant change in Resident Evil 4 Remake is that the knife, although it existed in the original game, it serves a far more utilitarian and important purpose in this remake. Because before, in the original, basically, the knife was just a badge of honor. If you beat the game with only the knife, you were excellent, or, you know, you used the knife for fun, or if you literally ran out of ammo, you used the knife. But the knife in the remake is actually ridiculous. Among other things, you can upgrade the knife at the merchant using the tune-up feature until it's one of the best weapons in the game. With game mechanics alone, it's never the best weapon, but it can be upgraded extremely to the point that it's kind of a no-brainer that the knife is one of your most important weapons. So in order to do that, Capcom has added a lot of new mechanics to the game versus the original. Not new in terms of the franchise, because a lot of these are existing Resident Evil mechanics. So first and foremost, the knife now is disposable. It can break, but you can also carry multiple knives, and you pick them up just like you would ammo or a weapon. So when you kill an enemy, they will actually drop knives. And you can have like 4 different types of knives in your inventory at once, and you can equip one, and then when it breaks, it'll just default over to the next one. So the first new mechanic for Resident Evil 4, anyway, is the Incapacitation kill. Basically the same thing as Resident Evil 6 or Resident Evil 5, where when you incapacitated an enemy, if you went up to their head or their groin or whatever, the game would give you a button prompt, and then you would stomp on them, or you would stab them or whatever with your gun. So instead of doing that in Resident Evil 4 Remake, now when you incapacitate an enemy and they're actually on the ground lying down, you can run up to their head and press R2 or right trigger or whatever button, and it'll stab them in the head and kill them. Combined with an updated version of the original game mechanic where when you would shoot an enemy, they may not necessarily die, they may actually sprout a plaga from their head. In the original game, there wasn't really anything you could do about it except keep on shooting them. In the remake, it's very obvious if they're not dead and they're going to grow a plaga out of their head, because you can see them twitching around. You can see a button prompt to press L2 or whatever button it is to stab them in the face, and that'll instantly kill the plaga, or it will damage them. Sometimes it won't kill them. Regardless, the knife can be used against almost every single enemy in the game, whether it's a boss or regular, even for just self-defense. In addition to that, you have the stun kill. So, for instance, if you throw a flashbang and they're blinded, you can run up behind them and stab them in the head, and it'll insta-kill the enemy. Assuming that your knife is upgraded enough to do the damage, some enemies won't get insta-killed by the knife in the back of the head. And you can also stab them in the front of the head sometimes, just depending on location. Speaking of the back of the head, that's another new mechanic in the remake. You can actually stealth kill enemies now to some extent. There's not really a lot of stealth about it, because unless they actually see you, you don't need to creep around. You could just run straight up to them and stab them in the back of the head, and it'll kill them. I've tested, and there is no stealth. It really doesn't matter. A lot of times you can shoot an enemy within 10 feet of another enemy, and if they don't actually see it, then they won't even know. So it's not really true stealth. There's no like sound-based stealth, only sight-based. So unlike other games such as Evil Within or whatever, Last of Us, there isn't really a stealth system. Another new mechanic with the knife is something that was in Resident Evil 1 Remake and Resident Evil 2 Remake, where if an enemy grabs you and you have a knife available, you can actually stab them in the head. And again, like I said, it will usually kill them. Sometimes it won't kill them. And this also ties into the knife durability. So as you level up your knife, you may be able to kill them in one hit without breaking your knife. A funny thing I've noticed is even if you don't have a knife, if an enemy grapples you, it will pop up with a button prompt where you have to mash X or A. But if you actually sit and do nothing, the grapple itself doesn't do any damage to you. The danger really only lies in another enemy walking up and attacking you at the same time, especially like a chainsaw guy. If you're being grappled while a chainsaw is about to swing at you, you will die instantly if you don't escape from the grapple. Among the new knife mechanics, going along with the fact that you can use it to escape grapples, you can actually parry the chainsaw with the knife. All you have to do is press the right button at the right time, and it will parry the chainsaw. However, it will completely destroy your knife in one hit, as it should. Of course, the most important new knife mechanic isn't exactly new, but it's just easier. In the RE4 Remake, there's actually a dedicated parry button. In Resident Evil 4 and Resident Evil 5, you could parry stuff that was thrown at you, but it was a hands-on experience. You had to actually equip or pull out the knife and aim, and then time the attack with the knife properly to actually hit the thing. So in Resident Evil 4 Remake, you just have to hit L1 or left bumper at the right time, and it'll parry the attack. A lot of combat in the game is actually focused around the parry, and depending on enemies, some of them will attack you multiple times in quick succession, and as you parry them, they eventually, it'll throw them off guard, and then you can melee them. And there's actually an entire boss fight based around that mechanic. As expected, the gem system for the treasures makes a return. However, it's a little bit more advanced than the original. There are 2 different types of gems and 4 different colors of gems: green, yellow, red, blue, and purple. Each colored gem is worth a certain amount of money. When you combine 1 or more colors of gems into a treasure, it increases the value of the treasure more than if you put in, let's say, 3 red gems or 3 purple gems or whatever, or only 2 red gems and a purple gem. If you put in 1, 2, 3, or 4 different colors, it gives you an increasing bonus when you sell an item to the merchant. So you can take an item, and the most valuable one I think is 100,000, and there's an achievement for selling an item for 100,000. So the original had the same mechanic, however, there wasn't a colored gem bonus, at least not to the same extent. The difference was in the original you had most of the same treasures, but they had predetermined jewels or whatever extra pieces that could be inserted into the treasure, which would maximize the sell value. It never actually told you how much each additional piece was worth. Simply put, if you didn't put all of the gems into the treasure before you sold it, then it didn't sell for the maximum amount possible. There is a point where the game gives you a tutorial explaining the gem system very briefly, but more importantly, while you're trying to inlay gemstones into the treasure, there is actually an on-screen display that shows what each slot is worth with each gem that you put in it, so you can mess around and see which gems cause the treasure to be worth the most money before you actually end up selling it. One of the coolest new features of Resident Evil 4 Remake is the attention to detail Capcom put into this game. In the original game on GameCube and PS2, weren't necessarily possible, or maybe just pushed the limitations of the system so they didn't exist. For example, in some areas when you're fighting, namely the village, you can see villagers will actually plant traps, bear traps. You can catch them in the act planting bear traps if you're far enough away. And the funny thing is, this actually explains some of the changes that existed in the original game when you would go back through the same areas. When you go back and forth through the village in the original game and in the remake at different times of day, namely after rescuing Ashley, you'll find that there are a lot of bear traps placed around the village that weren't there before, and you never actually get to see the villagers do it in the original. For instance, there are sections of the game where if you run too fast over wooden walkways, they will collapse and you'll fall to your death. Or there's a bridge in Chapter 2 where if it takes too much damage, it will actually snap the chains on the bridge and the bridge will collapse. So if you're on the bridge, you can fall to your death, or you can even blow it up yourself. It takes about 3 grenades and you'll see that the support for the bridge will just snap and the 2 halves will separate. And in this area, it is actually a danger depending on how you play, because there are numerous enemies that throw dynamite at you that can actually blow that bridge up with you on it and kill you if the dynamite itself doesn't kill you. So that's another cool little detail. Another good example is, again, during the initial village fight. If you go to certain areas while you're kiting the chainsaw guy, the Dr. Salvador, around, there are actually cutscene kind of things where you can see the Dr. Salvador will destroy parts of the environment. And again, when you come back through this area later, there are quite a few changes environmentally. Some of them you see happen in real time when you get there. Some of them don't really fit the cutscene that it shows. But if you get events like the Dr. Salvador cutting up the environment, then it explains the situation, which is pretty cool. It's worth noting, however, that even if the Dr. Salvador doesn't cut any of the environment up with the chainsaw, when you come back through this area, both of the sections that he can destroy are destroyed no matter what. So I'm not sure why they put it as an optional event and then made it happen regardless, but that's classic Resident Evil mysteriousness for you. In certain areas like the farm, animals will actually attack you if you attack them, and they will also attack enemies and knock them over. And then on the topic of animals, it's not really an attention to detail so much as it's just a funny accident that you can light the cows on fire and some of the other animals, and they will run around on fire. You can even set the barn on fire in the village fight, although I'm not sure that's not scripted. I've only noticed it a couple times, but I think it's just because I didn't notice it, rather than it being a random thing that can happen. On the flip side, one detail I won't forgive Capcom for is that you can't pet the wolf or the dog or whatever it is. They call it a dog. It's clearly a wolf. Regardless, you can't pet it. On the topic of the bear traps, enemies can now actually get caught in the bear traps if they haven't been set off already. As soon as they step into one, it'll close around their feet, and then it stuns them for about 10 seconds or so, during which you can shoot them or do whatever you want. There are several sections in the game where you can actually skip combat encounters. Not necessarily like the parts of the game, but you can actually skip combat encounters. Like the beginning of the game, if you shoot the church bells, you can actually cut the first chainsaw guy fight short. You can't avoid it entirely, but once it starts, you can actually make it end pretty quickly if you shoot the church bells. Or, for instance, if there's a locked door that's preventing you from getting to an item, you can actually blow it up with a grenade. On the negative side, one detail that doesn't make any sense whatsoever is in the original game, Leon had kind of like a Farnsworth video communicator from Warehouse 13, but in the remake, he just has an earpiece, like a Bluetooth headset, but every single time Hunnigan calls him, there's a video feed for some reason, even though he literally isn't looking at any kind of device that has video on it. So it's like, it just doesn't make any sense. So I don't know if they missed that or if they intentionally were like, looks good to me, ship it. Most of the worst parts of the game have been either completely cut out or they've been redesigned. For instance, the Hollywood-inspired laser hallway has been completely removed, thankfully. The U3 fight has been completely ignored and removed from the game. The entire section of the game that has U3 in it is just not even there in the remake. The Salazar statue running sequence has been completely removed. That section of the game is still kind of there, but it's completely different. The Krauser knife fight is still in the game, technically. On that note, they also have removed some of the more annoying enemies from the game, or they've been changed to fit in with the new game mechanics so that they're less annoying. Specifically the stun baton guys. They're still in the game, but you can actually parry them now, so it's essentially impossible to get hit. Thankfully, because they were some of the more annoying enemies in the game. The giant armored dudes with the two-handed morning stars, or the two-handed mace, the two-handed spike ball, I think it's a morning star. Those have been completely removed from the game. Technically, there are no like power enemies besides the goat guys, the goat/bull guys, and the Dr. Salvador's or Bella sisters, the chainsaw enemies. And they're used very infrequently. Also, the entire waste disposal section has been completely changed. One of the worst sections in the original game, hands down, was all of Chapter 5-2, actually, which was the waste disposal area, part of it. But specifically, one of the worst sections of the entire game, before you had infinite ammo, was technically removed. It is actually still in the game, but it's been completely changed again, like a lot of other things, where you have to use the wrecking ball to smash a hole in the wall. That's still in the game, but it's much less awful than the original. A lot of areas have been like completely redesigned or at least reversed, similar to what they did with Resident Evil 2, where they cut out sections of the game and like copy pasted them into a different point in the timeline, like the Kendo gun shop or that back alley. Those, like in Resident Evil 2 Remake, those were shifted around. Same thing with Resident Evil 4 Remake. They kept a lot of the same stuff, but they shifted it around. They kind of cut and pasted things at different points in the timeline, or like you go through an area in reverse of the direction that you went in originally. All in all, I mean, they did a good job of shifting things around while remaining true to the original for the most part. Most of the stuff they cut out or changed was because it was awful or because it could have been done better, and so it was done better. Ultimately, I think they made some trade-offs. The absolute worst two things about the original game were the camera and the fact that you couldn't move and shoot at the same time, which was solved long ago in gaming when Visceral made Dead Space. That was like the main huge new thing, is that you could finally move and shoot at the same time. And keep in mind, that was in 2008. That was 3 years after Resident Evil 4 came out. So that was actually the first game to make that change. Actually, Gears of War may have done it first, but the first survival horror game to make that change. And then, again, the camera. So in the original Resident Evil 4, the camera was just terrible. If you were inside of a building, it would like clip into the floor and it would look up at you from a weird angle, depending on whether or not you were inside. If you were outside, then the camera was more or less fine, but you couldn't move the camera and actually move the character independently of each other or at the same time. Not well, anyway. So even if you could run and shoot at the same time, you still wouldn't be able to really look around you. It was like a Lakitu from Super Mario 64 that would clip into the geometry. I mean, it was almost that bad in the original Resident Evil 4, where it would clip into the floor or walls and just make it needlessly difficult to see what was happening at times. And a lot of games at the time had the same issue, so it's not like Resident Evil 4 or Capcom are uniquely guilty for that. Essentially, developers just hadn't figured out how free-floating third-person cameras work, because obviously at that time you had games like Ninja Gaiden 1 that had the same god-awful camera issues. Thankfully, that's been resolved. When I say trade-off, initially, one of the things that I really didn't like, starting back with the chainsaw demo, the aiming it's just not the same as the original, but after you get used to it, I wouldn't say that it's bad. It's just slightly more sluggish. The recoil and the aiming combined kind of just feel weird compared to the original. And I think that's because the original just like didn't really have recoil, to be honest. And there's obviously the fact that they got rid of the laser sight, except for the attachment for certain guns. And even the attachment that is in the game is kind of lame and weak compared to the original. It's a very thin beam and it really doesn't go far versus the original, where it was like this thick laser beam that projected across like the entire game. So they've changed that. And again, once you play a lot, it grows on you and it doesn't really become as big of a deal. But it just still kind of feels like it's a little bit sluggish in comparison. However, given the fact that you can actually move around while aiming and shooting now, I'd say that it's not even relevant. I'd rather be able to move and shoot than be stuck to the same spot trying to aim and then failing because an enemy sneaks up on you or something. One of the chief reasons why Resident Evil 4 can never truly be a real Resident Evil game is that it lacks puzzles, and it not only lacks puzzles, but it lacks the Metroid slash Castlevania style of gameplay that those puzzles lead to. Because in all the original Resident Evil games, you have to do certain things with certain items, you know, solving puzzles in order to unlock the next areas that you need to go to, ultimately to unlock more puzzles to finally get to the end of the game. Resident Evil 4 was never designed that way, and it still isn't in the remake. There are puzzles, but you only ever have to solve a puzzle to unlock the next immediate area, so you can proceed to the next chapter. That said, they have added a lot of puzzles compared to the original game that do make it feel much more traditional. In addition to the fact that you can wander around from one area to another. Generally, although obviously you can't, once you leave the village, you can't go back from the castle to the village. And once you leave the castle, you can't go back to the castle from the island. So there are still 3 separate chunks of the game. But in general, each chunk has puzzles that you can wander around and solve, regardless of which chapter you're on in that section of the game. And so, again, they have added a lot more puzzles than the original RE4 had. But ultimately, it still doesn't make it the same type of gameplay as the originals.
No thanks.
By and large, most of those new puzzles are only used to unlock additional treasures or gems that you can sell to the merchant. They rarely ever have any kind of gameplay link. There are a few where unlocking the puzzle, if you could even call it a puzzle, will get you like a new gun. Like the M4 you can get by doing a quote-unquote puzzle. It's not really a puzzle. Players of the original game will also notice a few of the original puzzles have returned in the remake, but they've been redesigned to be either prettier or at least slightly more difficult, so that you can't just solve them right away with the same solutions. The original game really didn't have a lot of puzzles to begin with, so there weren't a lot of puzzles that they could have redesigned without doing a deep dive and comparing every single puzzle in the games. I think these two are probably the only ones that were actually in the original game. Mercenaries mode came installed with this game, basically the modern equivalent of on-disc DLC, which Capcom was so notorious for in the 360 generation. But it wasn't actually available for 2 weeks after launch, until April 7th. The patch to unlock the DLC was about 7 kilobytes, so if you actually look back at the patch notes, there wasn't even really a reason for the release of Mercenaries to be delayed. So the Mercenaries game mode in Remake plays similar to the original RE4, but the structure is more similar to Resident Evil 8, where there are a finite amount of enemies for you to kill, and in order to actually get the highest score possible, you have to get all the bonus time available and kill the enemies as fast as possible, with as much time remaining as possible. More so than you have to get a good combo. The additional time is not needed to kill all the possible enemies at all, as long as you kill everything fast enough. And when it's all left over, depending on how much time you have, it's going to add several 100,000 points to your score, which is completely necessary to get an S++ rank on each stage. However, there's no point in getting an S++ rank except for bragging rights, because there's nothing to unlock in Mercenaries mode. You start out with the village map, and in order to unlock the castle map, you have to get an S or S+ on village, doesn't matter what character, and then you have to get an S+ or an S on Castle in order to unlock the island map. But again, it doesn't matter which character, so that's what I mean when I say there really isn't anything to unlock. Merc's only shipped with 4 characters, Leon, Krauser, Hunk, and Luis, and it only shipped with 3 maps. Ada Wong and Wesker are missing completely and are speculated to be included later in the game. Compared to the original RE4, there's also at least 1 map missing. The available maps right now are Village, Castle, and Island. In the original game, there was a stage called Stage 4, which was like a floating base kind of thing out in the water. And it was the only map in the original Mercenaries that featured Super Salvadors, which are Salvadors, but they're bigger and they have a 2-bladed chainsaw. Basically, they take way more damage than normal Salvadors kill, but they're also worth way more points. So Super Salvadors have not been mentioned at all by Capcom, and again, there has been no mention about there being a 4th or 5th map added to Mercenaries this time around. Again, all 4 of those maps and all the characters, except Luis because he wasn't a character in original Mercenaries, all of them came on the disc or with the install in every single version of Resident Evil 4 before this, including the original. Even the original GameCube game had the Stage 4 level and all the characters. Unlike the original Mercenaries, this version includes a special bar known as Mayhem Mode that builds as you get points for killing enemies or doing melee moves, getting time bonuses, picking up combo time bonuses, or blowing up explosive barrels, things like that, doing melee. Once the bar builds up, it turns yellow, and then you can press in left and right stick in order to activate your Mayhem Mode. Depending on character, this does something different for each character, but it's essentially like a Spartan Rage mode. Leon gets faster fire rate, faster movement speed. Hunk gets infinite ammo. Krauser's Mayhem Mode is the Plaga arm from the original, but now he actually has 2 Plaga arms. So in addition to the lunge attack, he also has just a normal melee attack, which doesn't insta-kill enemies. The lunge attack will insta-kill any enemy in Mercenaries, including the chainsaw guys. But the normal melee takes about 3 or 4 hits. Additionally, he has the same weapons as the original. You can also dodge while you're using melee with your knife. So he is hands down the easiest character, him and Hunk, because of their special abilities. Last but not least is the new addition to Mercenaries, Luis. His loadout really isn't that great. He gets the Red 9 and the Springfields. However, his Mayhem Mode attack, he gets to plant a giant bundle of dynamite, which will kill tons of enemies and pretty much one-hit every special. However, you can only plant 1 at a time on the battlefield. So once you plant the first dynamite, it takes like maybe 15 seconds to explode. And then you have to wait for it to actually explode before you can plant another one. So it can't really be abused. And then on top of that, unlike me comparing it to Spartan Rage, you can't actually like portion out the Mayhem Mode meter. So once you use it, you have to use the entire meter until it's empty. You can't pause it and then restart it. So you're lucky to get like maybe 2 or 3 dynamite bundles per Mayhem Mode. Because of the special bar, Mercenaries mode in this version of Resident Evil 4 is significantly easier than the original. One of my other only complaints about this game, I only have 3, really. The second one, or the first one, depending on which one, whatever. One of them is the fact that they changed the combat from the original game. So in the original RE4, you would be able to shoot enemies in the knee or the shoulder or whatever, as long as you did enough damage wherever you shot them, it would actually stagger the enemy, and then you could run up to them and press whatever the button was to do a melee attack. In the remake, they've basically removed that entire mechanic. It's still in the game, but it only applies to certain areas. Like if you shoot them in the head hard enough, it'll stumble them. It is possible to shoot them in the knee or the leg and stumble them, but like 99% of the time it doesn't work the same as it did in the original game. On PC, there is a mod to re-enable this. On one hand, I can see why they did this, because with the mod enabled, trying to restore something similar to the original combat, the game is honestly a bit easy. And that's not a surprise. That statement applies 100% to the original game, and that's one of the reasons that I really never loved Resident Evil 4 as much as so many people do, because it is just too easy. It's too much of an action game. So the fact that you could headshot or knee shot enemies so easily and then just get a free melee attack that either killed them or added bonus time to your timer in Mercenaries was just kind of like ridiculous. And with the mod applied, it's still fun, but it is a bit too easy. And on that note, I mean, Mercenaries is already too easy in the first place, even with like the worst characters, like Leon. So it doesn't really need to be made easier. But if those mechanics applied to the normal game, that would be fine. Because, I mean, you could shoot an enemy like 7 times and they won't stagger. And it reminds me a little bit too much of Resident Evil 2 Remake, where they put in a randomizer, and I guess Resident Evil 3 Remake, in order to kind of maintain something similar to the original game and balance out the fact that you could actually aim in 3 dimensions versus the original. It does kind of seem like they've patched the game since release, though. That or the mod that I installed didn't uninstall, because I tried and it looks like it takes 2 shots to the same leg to get a stagger prompt. It never took any more than 2 shots to the same leg in all the testing that I did. So again, either the mod is still installed even though it says it isn't, or they actually changed that. Easily one of my only complaints about this game, and it's not a major complaint, really more of just an artistic disagreement, I would say. The main enemy of this game appears to be the Novistador. You would think it would be the Los Illuminados, cultists, or the villagers, or the Plaga itself, but it's really not. It's the Novistador. And you really don't understand that statement and how serious I am by saying that until you play the game, because you will fight so many Novistadors, it's absolutely insane compared to any other enemy type. Even compared to villagers, there have to be more Novistadors than villagers total. If you split up villagers and cultists and soldiers into different categories, because separately each category of human can't possibly have as many instances as the Novistadors in general, because from chapter 11 onward, you basically fight Novistadors in almost every single combat sequence. All of chapter 11, for instance, involves Novistadors, although it does have some villagers still and some Dr. Salvadors. Once you reach chapter 11, you fight countless numbers of them, and it doesn't start in chapter 11. They show up before that, but chapter 11 is where it gets really ridiculous, and you just fight insane amounts of them until the end of the game, literally until the end of the game, until the end of the very last boss fight, you will be fighting Novistadors non-stop. There's one entire room full of them where they just spawn constantly the entire time you're in the room.
Leon is a potty mouth.
There's a similar room before that room where you fight tons of them. And then just basically after they appear the first time in the castle, then it's
what the hell
off and on all the time. One final minor criticism that I do have about this game is the gore. It seems very odd to me that Capcom went to the trouble of putting in a specific setting to control graphic dismemberment that you can turn off or on, but the actual player death animations have been neutered. They aren't all terrible, and there really are quite a few good ones, but the actual good death animations are all contingent upon just being absolutely terrible at the game. You would have to not press any buttons when you're in a grapple hold, for example, or just intentionally take damage and die. The normal death animations when you're just taking damage from like crossbow bolts and stuff are pretty generic. Obviously what I'm saying doesn't make a tremendous amount of sense, because how can you criticize the good death animations requiring you to suck at the game when the entire point of the death animation is that you only see it when you die? But I'm just saying the player death animations could be better, or the variety could be better. If you're gonna die, it would be nice to at least get to watch some different animations rather than pretty much the same generic falling over dead animation every single time. And I say this in context of not just other remakes this year, but gaming in general. There's been this weird movement to like make everything as PC and accessible as possible, as child friendly. For instance, Star Wars blah blah Fallen Order, you literally can't dismember any organic enemies. You can dismember droids, but if it's something that actually like is sentient or, you know, has a heartbeat, then you can't. You're just hitting it with a stun baton, basically. Which is a stark contrast to every single Star Wars game ever made before, like Jedi Knight, where there was a setting to turn the graphic dismemberment up so that you could decapitate people and chop their arms off and stuff, etc. And again, Dead Space Remake had accessibility options to like tone down the gore, but Dead Space, for instance, is famous for being a game that had absolutely gruesome death animations. And like Callisto Protocol, for example, even had an achievement for witnessing every possible death animation. And the original Resident Evil 4 really wasn't any different. Like, if you got killed by the chainsaw guy, he literally chainsawed your head off. And you could see yourself get decapitated. So, like, in this remake, there are gruesome kills to an extent where they'll shove a chainsaw in your chest and they'll, like, cut upwards. But there's no graphic dismemberment about it. You know, you don't get split in two, or your head doesn't get cut off or whatever, or like when you get hit repeatedly with a hatchet and die, like you don't see your torso get bifurcated or anything with a hatchet. So again, it's just weird to me that like a game with a legacy like this of pushing the boundaries of graphic violence on a video game just totally went the opposite direction and said, not this time, guys, this game is for children. Because you would think if any game is going to revolutionize or like push a new level of gore, it would be a Resident Evil game. And to be fair, this isn't even the first time that Capcom has changed the animation, because the Japanese version of RE4 actually didn't have the decapitations in them, but the American versions, I believe, or may have been the only ones that did. My third and last complaint with this game, you would think based on my previous videos that it would be about the hand-holding, but honestly, whatever. I don't care. I got over it, especially on PC, because there's a mod to get rid of it completely. It's not that big of a deal. I mean, really it is, but it's not. My actual biggest complaint about this game is that they released it incomplete. And it's honestly not acceptable in 2023 to release a game like this game. So Resident Evil 4 came out March 24th. They announced on release day, or like right before release day, that the Mercenaries DLC would come out on April 7th, 2 weeks after release. They released Mercenaries, and then since then, even since before that, they haven't said a single word about anything else. So here's the problem. Resident Evil 4, the new version, is missing 75% of the actual game. The original GameCube release had Assignment Ada and Mercenaries on disc when it came out. So there's like 14 releases of Resident Evil 4 after the original. Every single one of them included Assignment Ada, Separate Ways, which was new to the PS2 port, Mercenaries, and the entire original game, and all the costumes and the bonus guns. Right now, this game doesn't have almost any of that except for the Knight costume and the Mafia costume, the Chicago typewriter, the hand cannon, and Mercenaries. It doesn't even have a complete version of Mercenaries either, and they haven't said a word about completing the roster or completing the maps roster or any other additional DLC, or whether it'll be free or if there will be a season pass or anything like that. A lot of this downloadable content has already been data mined from the game directory itself, and so future DLC is expected. But again, whether or not it's even going to happen is complete pure speculation because Capcom hasn't said a single word about Assignment Ada or Separate Ways, or if they're even working on any of them. In addition to all that, when Mercenaries did come out, they also added microtransactions to the game that just really have no legitimate purpose to exist. These are just currency, in-game currency. They're shortcut DLCs, just like Resident Evil 2 and 3 Remake had, where you can unlock all the guns and everything without having to actually play the game. You can make whatever argument you want. No one's forcing you to buy them, but it is completely ridiculous that they even exist. It seems kind of pointless to buy a game and then decide that you don't have the time to play the game, and so you still want to experience the game. So you're going to pay more money when all you could do is just play the game and earn it. But whatever. And more importantly, at least for PC players, if you have any intention of getting the microtransactions, just don't. Just use a trainer and give yourself free money or something. It only takes 2 playthroughs of the game in the first place to unlock everything. But if you really insist on using the microtransactions, just use a trainer and cheat instead. Unless you'd like to spend money for literally no reason whatsoever, then don't let me stop you. One of the announced DLCs is a PSVR exclusive VR mode, of course, which will only be on PlayStation 5 for the PSVR 2. No one should be surprised by this. It's bullshit, obviously, but again, this is just what Capcom does. This is what PlayStation does. No one should be surprised by it anymore. And yet we continue to give money to these companies, Capcom especially. I personally find it ridiculous. I don't even own VR and I never intend to, but it's just funny to me that Capcom will release pressers and talk about how the majority of their sales now come from PC, yet they continue to fuck PC gamers over and not release the same features on PC that are available for PlayStation. Because they did this with Resident Evil 7. They released a PSVR, PS4 exclusive VR mode for Resident Evil 7 on PlayStation 4, and PC, the main VR platform where all the actual people that own VR headsets do their gaming, did not get the DLC still after 6 years. And it's going to be the same case with this. And I think even Resident Evil 8 might have had a VR DLC for PlayStation. So that's also not on PC if it does exist anywhere. And again, they're going to do the same thing with Resident Evil 4 Remake. So it's just stupid to me because PC gamers will literally buy a game just because it's a VR game, just to have anything to play to test out, how good the VR experience is. So again, they're missing out on sales for no reason, like always, by refusing to have any type of system parity with their releases, at least as far as VR goes. All things said, I really do like this remake. Not as much as I like Dead Space Remake, I'll say that for sure. But as a person who bought every version of Resident Evil 4 when it came out, bought a GameCube just to play it, spent hundreds of hours playing it all the time, like literally all day and all night when it came out. I think it's a pretty good remake. I'm not going to say that it transports me back to childhood because I wasn't a child, or even, transports me back to 2005, because it really didn't. The game just doesn't feel the same. Like I've said, it has a more serious tone to it. It's not as campy. It's not as cheesy or intentionally stupid with the dialogue or over-the-top action or anything like that. It is a solid game as far as the mechanics go. Overall, like 99% solid, with some very small exceptions. But I just don't think that it's the second coming like a lot of people do. I'm not going to call it the greatest remake ever made, because it isn't. It objectively is not. It could have been the greatest remake ever made if it wasn't an incomplete game. And I'm not sorry to say it, but if you're going to remake a game that's been around for 18 years, you can't release 50% of the game and act like it's an acceptable thing to do. Like I said before, there's no mention whatsoever from Capcom when Separate Ways DLC is going to come out, or if there will even be an Assignment Ada DLC, or when the rest of the Mercenaries maps and or characters will come out. So, unlike all the people saying it's a 10 out of 10 masterpiece, etc., 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 it's not. I'm not going to give it a number. If I was forced to give it a number, I would say 8.5 out of 10, maybe 9 out of 10. And the sole reasons it wouldn't be a 10 would be what I just said. Again, I think it's a very good remake. I think they changed things that needed to be changed. They kept things that didn't necessarily need to be changed. There were some things that I honestly could have done without. Like the Dialog really didn't need to be in the game, but that fight was kept in the game, and it was almost 100% identical to the original. But even so, they did improve it by removing the incredibly obnoxious QTE prompts from the gameplay. But that's really the only thing they kept in the game that I personally thought could have just been left out completely. So again, it's a really good remake. If you liked RE4, or if you like Resident Evil and you've never played RE4, I absolutely would recommend buying it and playing it, obviously, as soon as possible. There should be more content to come, so I have no doubt at some point in time there's going to be like a Resident Evil 4 Remake Gold Edition or something like that, because every game since Resident Evil 4, except Resident Evil 4, has had one. And even Resident Evil 4 had one, I guess, technically, because it had the Ultimate HD version, which included everything ever for the game. So go out and buy it, or download it, however you do things. More content to come from me. I don't know what the next game is, but we'll find out. All right, everybody. Thanks for watching. Peace out.